So what I want to do today, there's actually three things on the agenda for today. So first thing that I want to do is finish up the discussion of AJAX in JavaScript because I did not get the opportunity to finish that up last lecture. Then I want to show you how the different scripts you wrote in your WebProject 3 kind of mesh with what you're doing in WebProject 4 as you're basically hooking up the client side with the browser side. And finally, go through jQuery as time permits, and especially some of the things that you might find helpful for the project. So without further ado, let's get started with that. And someone pointed out that there's a new API called, I believe, Fetch that has been added to the JavaScript language that mimics the jQuery interface to AJAX. Basically, the JavaScript developers appear to have taken some of the features of jQuery and incorporated them into the JavaScript language. The query selector method and the class list also appear to be taken from jQuery. But for this class at least, or this course, we're going to deal with AJAX. And in the future, I may upgrade to Fetch, but I'm going to use AJAX for this course. So as I went through last time, AJAX allows you to submit asynchronous requests to the server. And what that means is that the user can continue to interact with the web page while the server is munching on the request. Whereas if you make a synchronous request, such as what happens when you click on a link, then you actually cannot interact with the browser content while that new content is loading. Now, yes, you can interact with browser controls like stop the load from happening, but that's not the same as the web page content. So AJAX gives us a way to send requests to the server, allow the user to continue interacting with the web page, and then update the content of the web page depending on the results sent back from the server. And the AJAX object, so colloquially it's known as AJAX, but the actual name in the browsers is XML HTTP request. And you have to create an instance of that object in order to submit a request to the server. And the reason for XML is that that used to be the encoding used to ship information from the server back to the client. But these days, JSON is more commonly used because it's less verbose and hence takes up less bandwidth. Plus, it's JSON gets translated into a dictionary, a JavaScript dictionary, whereas XML gets translated into an XML DOM object, which requires some commands in order to access the node. So it's just easier to work with a JSON or generated dictionary than with an XML DOM object. So for a variety of reasons, JSON is now the general encoding technique used to send data from the server back to the client. So when you create a new XML HTTP request object, there's a few important methods and or properties that you might want to set. So the first thing is the load event, and that event gets triggered by the browser when the server has returned its result. And you basically just associate the callback function that you want to process the result, and that callback function should use those DOM modification commands I showed you on Tuesday to make the appropriate changes to the DOM object. So here's a simple example where we are, well, that is not a good example because that was, I meant to have that change this example so that it would be an AJAX example. I will get that changed. And I have a working example for you. So we'll go through that working example. Okay, so after you have added the callback procedure, another thing you need to do is initialize the request. And that's the open method. It takes the type of submit method, get or post are the two I'm familiar with, but I think you can also use a put method and a delete as well. And then you give as the second argument the name of the script, and if it is a get post, then the name value pairs using the same kind of URL construction technique you saw earlier in the course. So here we're calling the search.php script, and query and type will be keywords in the $_ array on the server side. Okay, then after the open, you actually initiate the request with the send command. And with a get method, you typically don't have arguments. With the post method, then you need to include the query string, which you see down here. With get, no arguments. With post, that's where the query string with the arguments is placed. So here's an example with the post method. You create a new XML request object, open it, giving it the post method and search.php. Then this little piece of magic is necessary with post methods only, but not with get methods. So you have to somehow, this sets the request header to indicate essentially that you're sending a post method, and that has some implications for how the arguments get encoded. So always, if you're doing a post method, make sure that you set this request header and basically just copy and paste this line. And then the send with the query string. So once the server has returned and you're executing that callback function, you'll have access to the AJAX request object in a couple important fields, or a number of important fields. Is the status field. So you want to see 200. That means that the request was executed error-free. If you get some other status code like 400 or 500, it means something went wrong. And you can check what went wrong with the status text message, but typically it's not very descriptive because we don't want to give hackers information about the website. So usually you just get something like error code, 403 server could not connect, or something like that. That doesn't really help you a whole lot. If you're a good developer, you can probably start leafing through things like the logs and the server and find out what went wrong, but we're not going to worry about that in this course. Then very important is the response fields, and that's where the server response is stored. And in this course, you're probably going to be looking at the .response field because that's where a JSON response is put. And in particular, what you can expect to find there is a dictionary that was created from the JSON response string that was sent from the PHP script. And remember, on the PHP side, you can use JSON encode in order to encode the output string. And if you use that JSON encode command, then on the client side, the browser will be able to parse it and create a dictionary object that you can then access. Now, you can also, the plain text version of the response is in a response text field, and that will contain the encoded JSON string, which you normally don't care about because you'd rather just access it as a dictionary. But if for some reason you just have a plain text response with no JSON encoding, you would find it in this property. And then if you returned a DOM object from PHP, which we're not going to cover in this course, it would be in the .response XML property. And then important again, you want to tell the browser how to interpret the response type. So that's the response type property in the AJAX object. And typically you're going to set it to JSON because you want it to interpret the response as JSON. So that actually, I believe, pretty much covers the important things. So you call new XML HTTP request, then the open method will give the type of the submit and the name of the script, the URL for the script. You will provide the arguments either as a continuation of this text string if it is a get method, or separately in the send method. The send method actually initiates the request, and the load event is the one that you want to associate a callback procedure with in order to handle the server response. And then these response fields give you that response information. So to show an example, I have a color ballot example that we can look at. So what it does, let's just first look at what it does. Actually, whoops, that doesn't appear to be the right. What was the one I used? It is, nope, here we go. Sorry. Okay. Back that up. And it's not found. Sure enough, it's because I need to say, frustrating. What am I doing wrong? /B Vander Z, no web home. There we go. Okay, so you get to vote for your ballots, and it records it on a server. And then the other thing it does is periodically, every 10 seconds, it updates things. So very quickly, I'm going to do a bunch of updates there, and then back, whoops, it looks like it already updated. Okay, let's do it again. Bunch of updates. Notice it hasn't updated here, but in 10 seconds it did update. So we want a very simple web application where we can vote for our favorite color. It updates it. And then I see some of you have been voting too. Thank you very much. So it updates everything. So to show you how it all works, let's go and take a look at the files. Okay, so if you want, this is not what I want. I want color ballot, sorry. I want the database version. There we go. Okay, So if you're doing this at home, there's a very simple table I created that kept track of the colors, the name of the color, and the count, and then inserted some initial values into it. So if you want to play with this on your own, just load this into your SQL server. It will set up the color table for you. Then color.html, you can see that it just is a table with colors, radio buttons, and on click, I submit the ballot, call submit ballot, and you'll notice every ID has the color name and then count associated with it. And that's going to give me the ability to modify this count. So when I send a request to the server and then I get the updated ballot counts, I'm updating these elements right here. Notice they're initially set to 0 and they're going to get updated then as appropriate. And notice here the onload. So after the DOM has loaded, I want request counts to be called, which is part of this count ballot.js. Okay, so again, remember onload defers execution of this script until the browser has created the DOM object. Okay, so then we have count ballot. And the first thing that we want to do is, going back for a moment, we have request counts. So when once the body has been loaded, we want to get the actual current counts from the database. So we create our new request object and add initialized counts will be our callback procedure. So that's what's going to change those count fields in the radio buttons to the appropriate values. Then I'm using a get method because it's just a query method. And that's where the script is located, getCounts.php. And I set the response type to JSON and send the request. So very simple. Then here's initialized counts. And I'm being a little reckless because you'll notice I'm getting the response without checking the status. I'm just assuming that the query succeeded, which is, as I said, a bit reckless. You want some error checking code there to make sure that it actually worked. But I'm assuming it worked and that what I'm getting back is a set of color and count values, which we'll see in a moment. So I am iterating through result, and that is giving me a color, and then I simply add or concatenate count. Remember that my count fields, okay, right there, they were all red count, blue count, green count. So these are the fields I want to modify. Okay, so I'm modifying those fields by getting the appropriate HTML node and then just setting its inner HTML to be color objects count. Okay, so I'm getting two values back. You remember each of those tuples had a color and a count. So that's all I'm doing. And then I want to update the display every 10 seconds. So you remember the set timeout method. So every 10,000 milliseconds, i.e. every 10 seconds, I call request counts. Okay, and then the other thing I have, actually, before we do that, let's see what this get counts looks like. So get counts Okay, so if you want to do this at home, feel free to copy it, and you'll have to fill in your net ID, your password, and your database name. I was actually using an XML document. That's what y'all are updating and playing with. So I wouldn't have to reveal my database or password. So on that end, I simply selected star from color, did what you did in WebProject4 with your prepared statements. So I executed it, bound the result to color and num votes, and then created an array, and then did a series of fetches and pushed the result. I pushed basically a object, a associative array, onto my array. So I created essentially just an array of 5 objects because I have 5 colors. Closed the statement, and when I was done, I echoed out my JSON encode statement. Okay, so fairly simple. But any questions thus far? I know I'm going somewhat quickly, so if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And I think this is very helpful for your web project because it shows a complete example of what's going on. Okay, so going back to count ballot, so going back to color.html, every time I click on a color, the onClick command is set to submit ballot this. So submit ballot is taking, remember I passed in the this pointer, so it's taking the, so I have access to the element that I clicked on, creating my HTML request object, setting the load event to update counts. And now I probably should have used post here because I'm actually modifying the database. So wish I had used post. I'll probably update it to use post. Normally when you're updating the database, you don't use get. But I did here, and you'll notice I'm creating a string with color equal to whatever the element's value is. Set the response type to JSON, and now I'm adding an extra parameter that my callback function can look at. I've never figured or seen a better way to pass something to a callback function than just simply adding properties to the AJAX request object. So here, when I come back to update counts, I want it to be able to know what color I changed. And so I set this property. I'm just adding a new property to AJAX request called color, setting it to element.value, and then I send AJAX request.send. So with update counts, I am updating it to its most recent value. So it may not be +1 because if other people have updated the color in the last 10 seconds, then the count will be updated by more than 1. So that's why I simply didn't just add 1 to that count. And in fact, you may have noticed that when I did add some stuff back here on color ballot, that it was at like 81, and a bunch of you had voted, it went all the way up to 102. You may not have noticed that, but it did happen. So at any rate, coming back here, this time I was better. I actually checked the result, and if there is no result, then I alerted that the update failed. Otherwise, what I'm sending back from the server is the color, and actually all I sent back was the result. I already knew the color because I saved it up here. So here I saved the color. So I'm actually using that saved value for the color, and then the inner HTML I'm setting to whatever the result was. And if we look at the script for ballot count, well, fortunately my password is no longer Smiley Girl, so that doesn't really matter. Okay, so we connect and get the color. So from the get statement, then we prepare the statement, update the count by 1, and let's see, check then to see whether we succeed it. So if we succeed it, then the affected rows will be 1. So if it's 0, it did not succeed, and we set success to false. And that determines what we return. So if we did not succeed, we JSON encode a false. If we did succeed, we actually get the most recent vote count. So up here, we simply updated the count. And then if it succeeded, then we need to actually update, not update, but get the current count for that color. And you can see that all we care about in this case is the number of votes that are returned. So while we get back the color name, all we really care about is the number of votes, and that's what we JSON encoded here, because we already knew the color. Okay, and again, if that fails, so we're also checking to make sure that the prepare statement worked. If that did not work, we're also returning false. So this gives an example of a little more comprehensive error checking than my other PHP file gave you. Okay, so questions about that? Anyone? Okay. So that pretty much, as I said, I think this is a good example to use for your web project. It kind of gives a good template for it. And if you look at my lecture notes for 420, you actually see a sample color ballot website, and solution code is in, and where that solution code can be found. Okay, so part 1 of today's lecture is done. Part 2 is what I want to do is try to show you how some of the tasks that you're doing for your web project correspond to the queries you had to do in WebProject 3. So you did 11 queries in WebProject 3. And all of them were meant, but one were meant to help you with a task that you need to do in WebProject 4. This one right here, this check weight, where you check the weight of the assessments, you can throw that one out, because I want you to do that check on the client side, not on the server side. I was just throwing that one in to see whether to get you to review group by. So you can throw this one out, because I just want you doing the checks on the client side. But the other ones, they all actually in some way tie in with something you do for WebProject4. So actually, let's take a look at that. And I'm going to have to kind of toggle between the video and what's going on. So let's see, bring this up again. Okay. So the first thing you do, you're logging in, okay? And you hit the login button. When you do that, you are going to be calling login.php. And it is going to be taking the email address and the password, and it's going to return, well, it can do one of two things. You can have it return the, I believe it's the section IDs that the professor is teaching, yes. So it's returning the section IDs that you can then use over here to populate this section menu. If it fails, then what I want is for you to print something that says invalid email or password. Okay, so it's going to either return some results, or this thing is going to in some way indicate that it failed. Okay, if it succeeds, then what you can do is launch a second request that is going to get you the outcome. So initially, when you come in here, what I want is the outcomes associated with whatever the first result that you returned is. So in this case, it's COS 402 Spring 2020 outcome, and there's only one outcome right now being assessed by that section. Okay, so this outcomes.php is giving you those particular outcome IDs. So you're giving it a section ID and a major. You're getting this section ID and major from this right here. So you have given the section IDs to the client. The client should have the section ID. It also has the major right here. So it has that information. It sends that information to the server. It now provides these as outcomes. Next, you want to send the selected outcome to the server. And when you do that, you want to get, actually come back here for a moment. You want to be able to populate the form with any pre-existing results for that outcome. So here, outcome 1 already has some information for results. It doesn't have anything for the assessment plan yet, because you can see it's empty there. And I don't believe it had anything either. So it also did not yet have anything for the narrative summary. So the only thing it had at that point was something for the results. Okay. And the queries that you care about are results.php, assessment.php, and narrative.php. So you'll probably combine these three into apr22.php. So I told you that the file that shows the form is named apr22.php. chances are you will put these three queries, you'll combine the code or copy and paste this code into abet.php. And these three queries will give you the data that you can put into your form and populate the three sections of your form. And then the remaining ones should be fairly self-explanatory. Update results is going to get called when, well, if I can, it's going to get called when you call save results. Okay. Assessment plan will get, or update assessments called with save assessments. And still not there. Still not there. Whoops. Unfortunately, I'm having a little trouble getting to the save narratives. There we go, save narrative. So in those three cases, when you hit those three buttons, you're calling update results, update assessment, update narrative. And then anytime you hit the delete assessment, so anytime you hit or press one of these trash cans, you're allowed to immediately remove the assessment if you want. You don't actually have to wait until pressing save assessments. I know that it says it only removes an assessment from the screen, but it's okay if you immediately remove an assessment when you hit this trash can, just to make your lives easier. Okay, and so that's the delete assessment. And then finally, update password.php. That one gets executed when you change your password. So right here with the submit button. So first, you confirm that the two are the same using JavaScript. Then on the client side, and if they are, then when you hit the submit button, you call update password. Okay, so that kind of gives you a feeling for what things are getting called when. Also, this outcomes.php is getting called when you select something from the menu, and I'm not too sure if I can find that. There we go. So when you select something from this menu right here, then you also need to call this outcomes.php in order to get the new set of outcome IDs associated with that section. And a couple things I just want to point out. So when you go from the login to the abet.php page, or you want to navigate when you click on the section, in the section menu, you want to navigate to the abet.php page. The way that you can do that is with the window.location.assign function. And that's a JavaScript function that will, when you give it a URL, it will load that page. So you'll give it the URL for your abet.php page, it will load it. And then for your outcome items, what I recommend doing is having your outcome items look like this. So basically, when the user clicks on the link, it automatically causes the abet.php page to be invoked, along with outcome equals 2. So you know exactly already which outcome you're searching for. And on the server side, in the session variable, you presumably already have the section ID and the major. So you only need this one piece of information. As I said, the PHP session variables would already be storing the other relevant information. Okay, and then finally, I got a question on Piazza about a problem you may encounter. And that problem is from login.html. When you call login.php, there's two possible outcomes, success or failure. And if it's a failure, you want to stay on login.html. And if it's a success, you want to go to abet.php. The way I did it was I actually had login.php return to the login.html page. And if it succeeded, so if it was success, I then did the redirection. So at that point, I did the window.location.assign and the URL for abet.php. And if it failed, then I made visible an error message. So made an error message visible. That so not the most efficient thing, because technically on success you only need you could immediately serve back abet.php, but it is what it is. From what I understand, the way that this is sometimes handled on real sites is you actually have an index.html page. And what that does is when the user types that, it immediately redirects to a login.php or a index.php page, something that is that immediately serves back a PHP page, and yet the user only sees an HTML page. Jordan, are you there or not?
Yeah.
So in your experience with your development, how has your company done it? Does it how does it kind of handle that landing on a front page?
We have different layers in front of this so that it doesn't really map to it doesn't map to a file system.
Okay. Okay. That's fine. Very good. So I'm guessing frameworks, I know the framework I use somehow does that. I haven't looked into it very carefully, but I know it's doing some kind of mapping from index.html to something else. So
for PHP, I think you can have the PHP server handle HTML documents. I think it's a configuration you can have.
it is? Okay. That's interesting.
I'm not sure about that, but I think so.
Okay. So at any rate, I guess I've made life a little bit difficult on you by not allowing you to start with a login.php page, but that's how I'm asking you to handle the situation is if you fail, the username or the password is bad, you stay on the login.html page. If it succeeds, then you redirect the browser to the abet.php page. Okay, questions about any of this? Okay.
I guess
That, oh
I,
yeah, go ahead. Hmm.
when this whole thing is being graded, or is this level of detail going to be inspected, like which AJAX calls are being
Nope.
made
No,
compared to
this
which?
is all up to you. I'm just
Okay,
giving
as long
you
as the
one way.
behavior matches.
I'm giving you one way to do it, not the way to do it.
Okay, so as long as the behavior
If you did
matches.
it a different way, it's totally fine, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So yeah, all that I think TAs have really been asked to do is make sure that you separated your code. Like you have HTML files, CSS files, .js files, and .php files. We don't want all your like style and JavaScript embedded in your HTML or .php files. So that's
Okay.
pretty much the limit. The PAs essentially just have a list of tasks that they're expected to perform, and they just go through that task list and see whether your interface does the right thing. And if it does, you get the points, and if it doesn't, you don't get the points.
Okay.
Is that task list something you're comfortable sharing with us so that we can know exactly what's expected?
I think so. The issue is that we are operating off of a different, what I'm happy to do is give you the task list, but not the data.
That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me go and edit the task list, and I will post that task list to Piazza. So that's a great idea. And then you have a checklist of what everything that needs to work.
Thank you so much. Would you care to post that along with the 2 source files you went over today in last lecture? Those both seem really helpful as well.
Yes. When you say source files, you mean the .html files or?
Yes, I'm sorry. Bad wording on my part. That's exactly what I meant.
Okay. Yep, I can do that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Other questions or comments? Okay.
We assume that
Oh, yeah,
all
go ahead.
instructors have at least one section.
Pardon?
Is it safe to assume that all instructors will at least return one section on the login.php?
Yes. I'm actually not planning to have an instructor that, yes, basically my idea is if an instructor is registered with the system, then the instructor has at least one section. So you don't have to worry about getting null results for a valid instructor.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? Okay. So in that case, that brings us, so we've done 2 of the 3 tasks for today. Task 1, finish up AJAX requests for JavaScript, native JavaScript. 2, go over how the PHP scripts you did for the last assignment map to the interactions with the interface that you're doing for your final project assignment. And then the last topic is jQuery. So it is kind of the original JavaScript framework, and it's not nearly as powerful as the frameworks that you have out there today. In fact, the book makes a distinction between a framework and a library. A library is actually jQuery. It gives you a set of tools that make something easier. In this case, makes it easier to interact with native JavaScript, whereas a framework actually is a complete approach, a design approach to designing a website. And it often imposes a software engineering model on you. For example, when I created this 8-bit website, I used Angular, and Angular imposes a model view controller perspective on it. So if I wanted to get a HTML page, I had to create a view object, then a controller that dealt with the interactions between the web page and the PHP backend page. And then I had to create a so-called model page, which was PHP and it dealt with getting stuff from the controller and communicating it to a view. So a framework, more general than a library, it may make use of libraries. In fact, I use jQuery with Angular, as well as Bootstrap is another library that gets used with Angular. So basically a library is just something that exists to make your life easier, and you can use it with or without a framework. In this course, you'll be using it without a framework. So the basic jQuery task that jQuery was basically invented to simplify some tasks that were difficult in JavaScript. And as I've already mentioned, some of those simplifications have already been incorporated into JavaScript. But the 5 big tasks that they were organized to do was DOM manipulation, user interaction with events, provide some simple animations for showing, hiding, and moving web page elements, and then dealing with AJAX, making it, hiding some of that ugliness that you saw. The book also mentions hiding browser inconsistencies. Those fortunately aren't as pronounced as they were in the early days of the internet. There's still differences between browsers, but standards that have been introduced that tend to have basically standardized a lot of what appears in browsers. So that portion of jQuery I left off simply because it doesn't seem as important to me as it used to be. So if you want to include jQuery in your web page, there's 2 ways to do it. One is to download whatever version of jQuery you want to use and store it locally, and then load it locally from your file. The other way is to get it from a content delivery network, and you can either specify a specific version you want, or by, I think, leaving off the version, you get whatever is the most recent version, which is really dangerous, as I discovered over the weekend, because again, for this very project you're working on, I was using chart.js to chart the results that you get from the results section. And I was downloading the most recent version of chart.js plus a couple other versions. Well, unfortunately, chart.js introduced version 3.0, which was not backwards compatible with version 2, and it broke the reporting parts of my website. And that was just because I hadn't realized that I was pulling the most recent version and it could break my code. It did. So I had to go back and actually specify specific version numbers that I wanted to pull from the server. And then after I did that, my code wasn't broken anymore. So I learned this lesson just in the last few days, that you need generally to specify specifically what version you want, because developers are constantly upgrading, releasing new versions, and they don't have to be backwards compatible. They can, and if they're not, they'll break your code. Okay, now this additional thing here, this integrity equals attribute and this cross origin equals, is a way of ensuring that if you are going to a third-party content delivery network, that it has not been tampered with by the third party, that they haven't inserted a virus, for example. So you often want to include these things, which you can get normally from like the jQuery website. It would give you what the integrity and what the integrity hash. This is effectively is a hash, a SHA hash, and it's showing how it's encrypted using a SHA hash. So this just gives you peace of mind that you're not downloading some tampered jQuery. Okay, so using jQuery in your JavaScript. Once you've loaded it, it's as simple as using either the dollar function or jQuery. They are the same function. Dollar is just a conventional shorthand for the jQuery function. And whatever arguments you pass to these two functions determines what gets done by the function. And they always return a jQuery object. And by convention, when you get a jQuery object back, you store it in a variable that starts with a $sign. Just that way, someone reading your code knows if they see a $sign variable that is likely storing a jQuery object. Okay, so the first thing jQuery did was it introduced a way to select objects using the CSS selector. So if you just give it a $sign and in a string with a CSS selector, it will return all HTML DOM elements that match that selector. And as I said, native JavaScript has basically integrated this type of selector into native JavaScript with the query selector command. So for example, if I want all paragraph tag elements, then this simple command would return an array of all paragraph elements. This one would specifically return the element with the ID hello. This would return all HTML elements that have the important class. Okay, so basically makes doing selections easy. The book has a number of other selectors, but these are the ones probably most useful to you in your project. Okay, then you can add and remove classes with the add class and remove class methods. And again, apparently JavaScript has now added the class list property specifically because this proved to be so valuable in JavaScript. So you'll notice here, $P is returning a list of all paragraph elements. And then this add class is being called on each of the paragraph elements. So even if it's an array, add class is iterating over each element in this array, and it's being called on each element. So it's being added to all paragraph elements. Okay, so we've already covered a bit with DOM manipulation. Now that's just with how to select. We haven't yet seen how to alter and remove. But then it made it a little easier to deal with events. So you can, two ways you can register events. One is with the on function, in which case you give the name of the HTML event and the callback function. Or jQuery provides essentially shortcut names for most of the HTML events. And the shortcut name is exactly the same as the HTML event name. So this is a function that associates the my callback function with the click event for my button. And again, if this is returning a list of objects, then it would add this callback function to every to every HTML element in the list. So as an example, in color.html, you'll notice that I had on click, on click, on click, on click. Very annoying because I repeated it 5 times. And I wrote a jQuery version of this one, which we may not have a chance to get to today. So And let's find submit. Right here, in one foul swoop, I added it with this statement. I said, select any input element whose name is equal to color and register with its click event the submit ballot function. So rather than having to have 5 different statements to register submit ballot with 5 different radio buttons, in jQuery, I could accomplish it with a single statement like this. Okay. So then the ready event is essentially an event like the load event for the browser, the body.load event. Ready functions essentially the same way for jQuery. So with the ready function, that function gets executed only when the browser has finished loading the web page's DOM and parsed it and created a tree. And it's so ubiquitous that actually, if you just pass a function to $, it is treated as the ready function. So back here, that's exactly what happened. You'll notice I have $function. I didn't even say ready. And so this one gets called as soon as the onload event. Essentially, as I said, this is called when the onload event for the body tag would normally be called. Okay, and it's automatically done for you by jQuery. Okay, then jQuery provided an easy way to change CSS styles. You saw one way is to add or remove classes, but that's static because those classes are static. And sometimes you need to be able to dynamically change a style element. So in that case, you may actually have to modify a specific CSS style element. The way you can do that is with the CSS command. You'll notice no longer do you say .style and then the property name. Instead, you just get the HTML element and then say .css. And then if you're only modifying one property, you just give it a pair. If you're modifying more than one property, you give it a object with key value pairs. So pretty simple mechanism for modifying CSS styles. So then we come to our animation effects. So you often want to be able to have things slide down or slide up when you create them, or have them fade in and fade out. And the book has a number of examples of that. So I don't have the time to actually show it here, but the jQuery essentially provided 3 ways to control visibility. So show, hide, and toggle immediately displays something or immediately hides it with no animation. So show immediately sets the visibility attribute to visible, and it shows it. Okay, and notice says it modifies it all at once and does it slow. I thought this just, I have to check this because I thought if you wanted something to show, it either showed or hid, and I didn't think there was a parameter to it. So I'm going to check this. So then you have an option of animating it when it's shown. So if you want it to show with a fade in where it comes in and the opacity starts at 0 and it goes to 1, then you can say fade in and you get the speed at which it fades in. Same thing if you want to hide it and you want it to fade out by going from an opacity of 1 to an opacity of 0, which is translucent. And then fade toggle will toggle whatever the visibility slot is. Then slide down and slide up, so you can see fading affects the opacity, sliding affects the height. So you can see something slide down or slide up as you're doing your thing. So it's a little less jarring sometimes than having something just kind of explode onto the screen. The animations kind of lead your eye to it, and it's like a nice transition rather than an abrupt transition. TV shows used to do this with commercials. There used to be a short pause, in effect, before the commercial started, and that kind of allowed your brain to register the fact that a commercial was starting. These days, many programs cleverly disguise the fact that they're going into a commercial by simply cutting straight to the commercial, and you end up watching the first part of the commercial because you don't realize that it's a commercial and not a continuation of the show. So these animations provide a nice way of telling the brain, hey, something is changing. Take a moment to orient yourself to this change. Okay, and then you can see what the different values are set to. So slow will do the animation in 0.6 of a second, normal in 0.4 of a second, fast in 0.2 of a second, and then if you want, you can provide your own argument to it. Okay, and since we are running out of time and the animation order isn't quite as important, I'm going to skip over that and go straight to the DOM, how you can modify the DOM. So you can basically use the prepend, append, before, and after statements to put things where you want. So here with an ordered list, I'm prepending a new item to the beginning of the list. Here I'm prepending something to the end of the list. Here I'm putting something before the H2 element. So here's H2, I put it before the H2 element. Here I'm putting something after the H2 element. So essentially it's as long as you have the element, this will put it basically, this is your next, becomes your previous sibling. This becomes your next sibling. This becomes the first child. This becomes the last child. So pretty simple. And then easy to remove things. This removes whatever is in this tree. Or so for every line item in this ordered list, it got rid of the line items, giving you that. If you don't want to actually lose them, if you want to get a list of what you deleted, you can use the detach command, and that will remove them from the tree, but not actually delete them in case you want to add them somewhere else. Then the HTML and text elements allow you to put a new text at that particular location. They function much like the inner HTML one and the inner text attribute. This is not like text content because it actually strips the tags. So here we ended up getting the contents of this P, which was A, B, and C, and added that text to this div. And you'll notice in this div, it got set to A, B, C, and the B and the /B tags were stripped. So the text tags function strips all HTML tags, whereas the HTML function preserves those HTML tags. And if necessary, builds a DOM object for you. Okay, and finally, we have, I know I'm going to run over by a minute or a couple minutes, but just to show you what the AJAX GET and POST requests look like. So basically, jQuery got rid of the need to create a XML HTTP request object. It basically bundled everything into either a GET or a POST. And I know there's also an AJAX command. You don't need it for this course. GET and POST will work just fine. So GET and POST essentially package up that open command, that send command, the load where you called the event listener to associate a callback with the load event. It basically packages all that into a single function call. So here, this is an example from the book where we want to be able to, when we enter some information with a button, we want to then put that information into this div. So you see here, the search, it's click function. What we're doing is we first bundle up our data that we're going to send in the request. So the title is whatever the value is in this text object. So we got the title and we got its value. So whatever the value of this input item was, the jQuery val function returns its value. So that will be associated with title. So basically, instead of having to create that query string that you saw earlier with the question mark and the equal signs, you just bundle up your data into a dictionary object. Then the get call gives the name of the URL for the script, your data, which is a dictionary, your callback function, and how you want the response parsed, which in this case is JSON. Then the callback function takes a data object, so that replaces the response field of the AJAX request. So it comes back, if you treated it as JSON, it should come back as a dictionary. And in this case, what was returned by the server was title, rating, and year. And you can see that I find this movie info, and I am setting its HTML to a tag where I cite this title right here. I cite, or then after that, I just say rate it and the rating, data.rating, and released in data right here, .year. So these get and post functions significantly simplify the calling of an AJAX, or making an AJAX request from the client to the browser. You're free to use jQuery in your projects, so you can use either native JavaScript or you're free to use AJAX. And if you're familiar with the fetch interface, I'm fine if you use the fetch interface. That works as well. So that pretty much wraps up our discussion of JavaScript. I'll post an additional color ballot script or site that I did using jQuery. So if you want to use jQuery in your project, I'll also post a color ballot version using jQuery. I'll post it to Piazza. And then on Tuesday, the last day of class, we're going to switch gears completely. And we're going to talk about a completely different way of creating a web interface using a technology called Node.js. And unlike what we've been doing so far, Node.js uses JavaScript both on the client side and the server side. And while PHP is used much more than Node.js is on a cumulative basis, I suspect that more projects that start from scratch these days are being created using Node.js. So we don't have time to go into it in detail, but I did want to spend a lecture going over Node.js, so that's what we will do on Tuesday. So I will see you all then. And if you have any questions, feel free to stick around. Otherwise, you're free to go, and I will see you on Tuesday.